Hi there, welcome to Threads. My name's Luke. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about drums and drum maintenance. So stick around and we'll get stuck in. So, drum kits. Drum kits form, I guess, like one of the basis of the band if you're playing in church. And it can be a huge help. It can help us to worship really, really well, and it can lead people really strongly into a song or into a section. But it can be a massive distraction, especially if the drummer's playing too loud. I'm sure we've all heard that before. And especially if we're playing, I guess, a kit that might not be tuned very well or maintained very well. It's the worst thing when you turn up to church to play and everything's just in a bit of a mess. It doesn't sound very good, and it can be really hard to lead people into a place of worship when the sound that we're making is so physically distracting. And I guess everything that we talk about today is all based on that heart. It's all based on bringing people into a place of worship and helping them to get there without being distracting and taking them away from that place. It's about tenderly stewarding that place of worship and that intimacy with God. You want to be conducive to that as best as possible and not take away from that. And the way we're going to talk about that today is through, I guess, maintaining our instrument. We've talked a lot about playing before. Please check out that video. It's really good. The guys there had so much to say about playing, and it's absolute gold. Please check it out. But today we're going to be talking a bit more about how to maintain and tune and choose our bits of instrument to make sure that we're giving the best sound and we're doing the best job for our church. So let's first talk about drum choice. Often we have very limited choice in what we're doing and what kit we can play. Often it's just there is one drum kit at church and that's it. If that's the case, often we've just got to run with what we've got, right? We've got to tune it up, we've got to make sure that it sounds good and do our best to play really well for that environment. But sometimes we've got a bit of a budget. We can choose what drums that we can play with. We can choose what drums that we use. And in that situation, that's an absolute blessing, an absolute dream. Hallelujah, praise God. And so it's really important that we choose drums and we choose our instrument to serve the purpose of our church. And I'm going to say this now because this is a really hard thing. I guess the tone of your drums and the tone that we're trying to reach, it is totally subjective. There's no real way that I can sit here and say, you for your church, you have to have this drum kit and this sound, because that's just not true. Everyone has an opinion, everyone has a personal preference on what drums should sound like. I have a personal preference. We often joke and laugh about our differences in preference, but at the end of the day, it's about what serves the purpose really well. And sometimes that can be preferential, stylistic choices, but often it can be just whatever's the cheapest or whatever is the best for the environment. So I'm going to talk about a couple of different things. I'm going to talk about cymbals as a whole, and I'm going to talk about, toms and shells, so like the bass drum, the snare, and the toms. And I'm also going to talk about snare drums. So let's talk about cymbals first. The guys mentioned it before. Again, this is all with the caveat, it's got to serve the purpose of the church. It's got to serve what you're doing. And I guess I'll talk about a couple of different environments just to give you a bit more of an idea about why you might choose some cymbals and why you might choose some shells. And I guess with that information, you can go away and make the best decision that you think is right for your church. In the other video, again, the guys talked a lot about their cymbal choices, and they go for like big, dark and dry cymbals. And actually, I'd really suggest that actually big and dark and dry cymbals might work really well, especially for smaller, more intimate environments. Maybe you haven't got a drum screen, maybe you haven't got, the drum kit isn't mic'd up. And so playing too loud might actually happen way too easily. I'm sure we've all heard that. We always get those comments, oh, you sound great, but if you could just keep it down a little bit. It can be really frustrating, but actually at that time, it's really important that we honor those people and we honor the environment, like I've said. So choosing cymbals that aren't going to absolutely blast out and cut through is really important. So those big, dark, dry cymbals, even if you do give them a bit of a whack, they will open up, they will give a really nice tone, but it won't cut through and be piercing and I guess aggravating. And so I guess that's partially about a volume thing, but about a tone thing as well. You can get the same tone, the same effect of loud energy and passion without the volume and the piercing cuttingness. These cymbals that I've got here, this is a Zildjian K Ride, this is an Avidus 17 Thin Crash and Avidus Master Sound hi-hats. I guess what you'd say is these are very middle of the road. Compared to like the absolute dark dry end, these are kind of middle of the road, and then obviously you can go all the way far the other end and you can go for like the A custom brilliant finishes, which will pierce through anything. And I guess if you're playing in a church with hundreds and hundreds of people and you're behind a screen, you might want to go for brighter, more attacking cymbals so that it cuts through the mix, so that people can hear it really well. And so I think it's really important to choose your cymbals based on what you're mostly going to be playing in. Let's talk about toms. Now, I guess in pop music these days, in our church pop music, so if you think of the Hillsong, the Bethel, toms play a really important role. They can be quite stirring, they can be quite powerful, and they lead to incredible builds and an incredible tension that we can build and release as and when possible and when necessary. So toms can play a really important role, and I think it's really important to choose, I guess, toms based on, again, on your environment. Here we've got a 12 and a 16. We've also got a 10 and a 14 tom as well. And so we can get a total mix of what we like. I'd suggest that if you're going for that sort of like modern worship genre, then you go for big toms. That's probably a good thing. The same with the snare drum. If you're going for that, I guess, like that modern pop sound, the pop worship sound, you want a big snare drum, maybe a 14. This is a 14 by 5.5, but you can easily find 14 by 6, 14 by 7, sometimes 14 by 8 snare drums. They can just give that huge, chunky, fat sound that we're looking for if you're going for that worship sound. The great thing is about those toms as well is that even if you play them very lightly, you still get a lot of that boom and that resonance. So if you're playing in a small environment, actually that can be really nice as well. And we'll talk about dampening later, but even though they're big, you can just dampen them out and get the right sound that you want. Same with the snare drum. With a bigger snare drum, you can get a really huge fat sound, but you can tune it really nicely so that you can get a nice crack sound. So if you do want to play in a small environment and you can get some warmth and some really nice tone, you can. But if you also want to play in a huge environment where you want a real piercing snare sound and a loud, like I guess if you're rim shotting, then that can be really versatile as well. So drum heads are really, really important to the sound that's being produced. We've talked a lot about the shell sizes and exactly, I guess, what that sound would do, but the drum heads make a huge difference and often can make the difference between sounding really good, sounding really tight and being really encouraging and conducive to a good sound and a worship sound. Or they can be really distracting and sound really bad. So the drum heads, again, and I'm probably going to say this all the time during this video, it's totally subjective. It's down to your needs as a church, as a worship team, and it's down to the what's necessary for that instance, for that environment. And here, again, here's a couple of pointers, a couple of suggestions. Often, budget is a big, I guess, influencing factor in when we're choosing our drum heads. And unfortunately, I guess you can get some cheaper drum heads and you can get some more expensive drum heads. But in general, they all kind of do the same thing. They're all drum heads, right? And the difference between the cheap ones and the expensive ones isn't too much. And as again, in our Threads videos before, we've talked a lot about taking care of your gear and buying expensive gear, not because it's expensive and because of the sake of that, but because actually it normally lasts a lot longer and it's probably worth it in the long run. So here we've got Remo pinstripes on the toms and we've got a coated ambassador on the snare. And I guess that's kind of like a coated ambassador on the snare is really, I guess, quite common. For the toms, it totally depends on your sound. We went for pinstripe because we like that big boomy sound. And also the pinstripes are super durable. I think they're 2-ply. They're really thick ply as well. So that no matter how hard they get smacked, it will always endure I guess that pummeling, especially when it's really going and you're playing up here, full molar. So I guess what I'd suggest is maybe go for slightly thicker drum heads because they'll last longer. Drum heads last a little bit longer than we like to think we do. and that's all down to tuning, and we'll come to that in a little bit. So drum heads are totally subjective. Choose things that work for your environment. If you're playing in a small environment, I might suggest playing coated heads, especially on the toms. It just gives a bit of a warmth, and even though it has more attack, it has more of that clicking sound when you hit. It's actually a lot more of a warmer, more rounded sound, and at lower volumes can sound a little bit more full, whereas with a clear head, I guess you have to maybe hit a bit more through the drum to get the proper tone that you're needing, which means you play louder, just naturally. So that's a little bit about our drum heads, about what we're choosing. So what we've talked about today is we've talked about different cymbal choices, choice of drum kit, what works for your setup, what works for your church, what works for your congregation. So next week, what we're going to be talking about is a little bit about dampening, how to get a drier sound, how to get more of a ringy sound, an open sound, and using loads of different stuff. So stay tuned, and next time we'll talk a lot about that.